On Thursday, the Financial Times reported that a number of EU member states, including France and Germany, were discussing a radical overhaul of the EU's External Action Service, or EEAS, which effectively functions as the EU's foreign ministry and is currently led by former Estonian Prime Minister Kallas. While there are apparently a number of options on the table, one of them would involve basically stripping powers from Kallas and returning foreign policy competencies to member states and the European Commission. So in this video, we're going to explain what the EEAS actually does, why some member states don't like it the way it currently functions, and what reform might actually look like. Russia once liked to think of itself as a major regional player. Perhaps it still does. But with resources depleting and attention still focused on Ukraine, the country's broader sphere of influence is shrinking. So in the latest issue of our magazine, we unpack how Russia's influence in their sphere is slipping away. That's just some of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's start by explaining how the EEAS came about, and what it actually does, because this probably won't be a familiar topic to anyone who isn't passionately interested in the Brussels bureaucracy. The EEAS was first described by the Lisbon Treaty, which was signed in 2007 and came into force in 2009. The treaty created a new role, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, in other words, a foreign minister, and envisioned a dedicated diplomatic service to support it. The EEAS was then formally established by a council decision in July 2010, becoming operational on the 1st of January 2011. The logic behind the EEAS was to consolidate what had previously been fragmented across several institutions. Before Lisbon, questions of foreign policy were handled awkwardly by two separate figures: the High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, a post within the European Council, and the Commissioner for External Relations, a post within the European Commission. On top of this, there were also the rotating Council presidency and the President of the European Commission, who both played a role in representing the EU internationally. In creating the High Representative, the Lisbon Treaty aimed to essentially consolidate all these foreign minister-adjacent roles into a single position. To further consolidate their power, the High Representative would also serve simultaneously as the Vice President of the Commission. Their staff in the EEAS would be drawn from three sources: the Council Secretariat's existing foreign policy units, the Commission's Directorate General for External Relations, and diplomats seconded from member states' national foreign services, who must make up at least 1/3 of EEAS staff. The first High Representative was Catherine Ashton, a relatively unknown Brussels bureaucrat who didn't really leave their mark on the position and struggled to assert herself. Ashton was succeeded by Federica Mogherini, who was also criticised for being essentially too timid, especially after Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass. Next was Josip Borrell, who did a better job of establishing himself on the international stage, but attracted early controversy for attending a press conference in Moscow at the same time as Russia was expelling European diplomats for attending rallies for Alexei Navalny. After the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Borrell changed tack and pushed hard for the EU to send lethal military aid to Ukraine. Borrell was then a relatively vocal critic of Israel's military conduct in Gaza after October the 7th, and pushed for stronger EU action on the issue. In retrospect, Borrell was ahead of the curve here, but at the time this put him at odds with several more pro-Israel member states and the Commission, which was less explicit in its condemnations. Under Borrell, the EEAS staff ballooned, and today cost the EU something like €1 billion a year. Anyway, in 2024, Borrell was succeeded by the current High Representative, Kaja Kallas, previously the Prime Minister of Estonia. Kallas has done an even better job of establishing herself as effectively the face of European foreign policy, and is probably one of the most well-known politicians in Brussels. Kallas has been outspoken and conspicuously hawkish on basically every EU foreign policy issue. On Russia, she has consistently pushed for military escalation, and even suggested during her time as Estonian Prime Minister that it would not be a bad thing if Russia were to collapse into many smaller states. On the US, while she's generally pretty Atlanticist, Kallas nonetheless ruffled some feathers last year when she suggested, in the aftermath of the explosive Oval Office meeting, that the free world needs a new leader. And on China, she sparked controversy earlier this year when she appeared to compare China and its trade practices to a cancer that Europe needs to address with metaphorical chemotherapy rather than morphine. Anyway, this knack for generating hawkish headlines has made Kallas pretty unpopular with both member states and the Commission, who, even if some of them agree with her general orientation, worry she's too reckless and that she's essentially setting EU foreign policy without their permission or consultation. This has become a more acute point of tension in recent months. As well as those comments about China, a number of member states, and von der Leyen herself, were apparently furious with Kallas after she posted, barely hours after the first strikes, a message on X implicitly endorsing the US war in Iran, and implying the EU could help guarantee freedom of navigation around the Arabian Peninsula. Unsurprisingly, as it became increasingly clear that Trump's war in Iran wasn't going to plan, and that most of Europe wanted nothing to do with it, Kallas's comments started to look increasingly off-key. More recently, a number of European politicians have privately argued that Kallas is essentially an obstacle to peace between Russia and Ukraine, given her long-standing skepticism towards negotiations and reputation within the Kremlin. And, well, this is probably the main reason that member states are apparently considering gutting the position and the EEAS. They just don't trust Kallas, and they think her perma-hawkishness has had its time. They have half a point here. Kallas is clearly somewhat gaffe-prone, and probably isn't best placed to negotiate a sustainable peace with Russia, if that's what the EU wants. But the fundamental problem here isn't Kallas, it's that the High Representative and the EEAS are yet another institutional fudge. They're expected to act as the EU's foreign ministry, but they lack the legal authority to really do anything. Foreign policy is defined in the EU treaties as being exclusively a national competence. Foreign policy decisions require unanimity amongst member states, and the Commission President has most of the EU's actual policy power. This is fundamentally why the first couple of High Representatives struggled to do the job. Furthermore, even though this is exactly the problem the position was created to solve, the Commission and Member States have never been wholly comfortable delegating real authority to the High Representative. This is why national governments insisted on having their diplomats in the EEAS, why they didn't just call the High Representative a foreign minister, and why outspoken High Representatives, like Borrell or now Kallas, inevitably get flack, whatever their actual positions. The point we're trying to make is that, if none of the 4 High Representatives have succeeded, it's clearly the office, not the office holder, that's the real problem, and the EU fundamentally needs to decide if it actually wants a foreign minister, and the redistribution of power that implies. When a story like this breaks, the headlines aren't just fast, they're fragmented. Depending on where you get your news, you might be seeing a completely different version of the same event. So, how are you supposed to know who and what to trust? It can be overwhelming trying to read into language and tone to figure out a particular bias. Well, luckily, Ground News will do all that work for you. Ground News is a website and app that helps you make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. With thousands of articles being thrown at us every single day, it may feel impossible to just understand a story, never mind fully comprehend the bias behind each outlet. Well, Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, finally giving you an effortless way to consume news and digest media bias. And within each article, you can even find comprehensive breakdowns into the ownership, bias distribution, and factuality. Take this story on Kallas's recent comments about Pakistan, for example. We can see that there are 27 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. Taking a look at the headlines, we're able to understand the differences in reporting on each side, with the left focusing more on the formal welcome and the right shifting the emphasis to the geopolitics. And it's not just the stories we see that shape the narrative, it's the ones we don't. With Ground News' blind spot feed, you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your feed, both local and international, keeping you fully informed even outside of your media bubble. And this is so important, as a Duke University study finds that exposure to news blind spots can moderate positions and reduce issue polarization. So, if you want to start questioning the narrative, you can join Ground News today, and using our link, you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description, go to ground.news/TLDR, or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.